very first thing he said to me was, I want this place to be for everyone. So he was very culturally inclusive. Understanding programmatically, it was sort of focused on the Indigenous community in Toronto, but he wanted it to be part of the city.
Welcome to the Design Hive, the Stantec Buildings podcast. Today we're talking with architect Michael Moxam, and our discussion today will be about collaboration and cultural drivers on the design of the Anishnawbe Health Toronto Indigenous Community Health Center. But before we get to that, Michael, if you could tell us a little bit about your role with Stantec, how you got here, where you're located, and what sorts of projects you do on a day-to-day basis.
So Michael Moxam. I'm an architect working out of the Toronto office. I have done so for the last, we joined Stantec in 2004. Previous to that, I was a partner in Dunlop Architects, which was an acquisition of Stantec at the time. I have a role in terms of design excellence and sort of encouraging the evolution of design culture within our office and across the system. I'm very much involved hands-on at a project level. I've always loved, design in whatever form it takes. I've never been sort of sector driven. To me, every project is the context it's in, the site it's on, the culture that it thrives in, and how architecture can embody all of that. Whether it's a hospital, a clinic, like in the case of Anishnawbe, an office building, an educational facility, a person's house, it's all very much a passion for me in whatever form it comes in. So
That's really interesting. I love the evolution of design and how that's implemented on projects. So I'm looking forward to this discussion here and seeing how that we can communicate that and share with the people about this project. So if you can give us some information about the project, who the client is, Anishnawbe Health Toronto, where the building is located, and what makes this project special and what it means to the people.
Anishnawbe Health Toronto is an organization that's been established for many years. I want to say 30 years. I might not be totally correct on that, but it's close to that. And they've been operating out of a number of facilities in downtown Toronto for many years. So this project is an opportunity for them to bring all of that together under one roof. We've been involved since 2014 is actually when the contract was signed. We might have been around a little bit before that. The health center itself is not a huge building. It's about 40,000 square feet. And the province had given Anishnawbe Health this 2.5 acre site in the West Donlands district of downtown Toronto. And if you were to talk to Joe Hester, the director of Anishnawbe Health Toronto, at that time, he would say they did not give it to us. They gave it back to us. And that was a very important distinction for him and a very important idea. So Anishnawbe Health had this 2.5 acre city block in one of the most important urban revitalization zones in a downtown area, pretty much in any city in North America. It's evolved over the last 15, 20 years from virtually nothing to a fully built up precinct of the downtown core. Joe knew that a health center couldn't sit on this 2.5 acre block all by itself. It just wouldn't be viable at any level. So we started working with him ourselves and Turo started working with Anishnawbe Health, thinking about what that block could be. And we had stakeholder engagement sessions. They would throw ideas out. What about, could residential work there? Could education work there? Could there be a daycare? There's the Canary Building is a designated heritage building on the site. What role could that play in the evolution of this site? So we developed some ideas with Joe. That's the first sort of place where the idea of thinking about an urban block as a landscape first came about. What if we thought about a whole city block as a landscape before an opportunity for a built form? And so that's where that idea where the seed of that idea was planted. And then with some of that information, Anishnawbe Health put together a kind of an RFP document to the developer industry, the developer groups, to see if they could bring a developer in to help with the evolution of the entire site. They retained, through that process, they retained a joint venture of two developers, Dream and Kilmer. So Dream Kilmer were brought in with their design team led by BDP Quadrangle. When that group joined, we connected with BDP Quadrangle and we started with them collaboratively to further envision what this city block could be like. That process resulted in the diagram where the health center court on Cherry Street and, the residential sort of wrapped around the other edges with the corner of Mill and Cherry Street being this open plaza connecting to the distillery district and the other corner being the Heritage Canary building. And then in the center, very importantly, this idea of landscape first sort of materialized as this First People's Garden that is an accessible outdoor garden space for the health center, physically and visually. For the rest of the site, the residential and education, it's a visual and organizing amenity, but only the health center has access to it. And so that was sort of how the whole block, the master plan for the whole block developed. And while we were doing that, we were also designing the health center. We were going through the kind of urban planning considerations of that. This idea of thinking of the site as a landscape first really encouraged this idea of transparency from the city to the central garden. So that the city actually knew when you walked by on the sidewalk, you understood what was at the center of that site, which is incredibly unique. Every block in that district has a courtyard, but you wouldn't know it unless you lived there or somehow otherwise were invited in there. This one, when you walk by on Cherry Street, you can look right through the health center and you see the beautiful landscape of the garden. So it's a pretty unique sort of urban connection. Joe Hester, who is I mentioned him before, was the director of Anishnawbe Health Toronto. He unfortunately passed away last year, so he didn't actually get to see the health center fully materialized, but I certainly had the opportunity of meeting him on site to review mock-ups and things like that. But the very first thing he said to me was, I want this place to be for everyone. So he was very culturally inclusive. Understanding programmatically, it was sort of focused on the Indigenous community in Toronto, but he wanted it to be part of the city. So this was an important idea relating to that.
It sounds incredible. The pictures and videos I've seen of it is looks amazing.
Yeah, it
It's
turned out well.
pretty striking. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so the collaboration there, you've got private developers as well as you mentioned some of our Indigenous partners on that. And I'd like to ask a few more questions around
Yep.
those two partners, so Turo and Anishnawbe Health Toronto. So if you could talk about the collaborative process with both of them, starting with Turo Architect and their role and kind of how they helped shape the vision for this and the expression of Indigenous culture.
It's important to know that this isn't the first time we worked with Turo architects. We worked with them probably back in the early 2000s at Trent University, and it was the Peter Zosky First People's House of Learning. So Indigenous Affairs, the educational department, Indigenous Studies was a very big part of that program, and they were a very big part of the design. So that we got to know them quite well through that process. So when this opportunity came up, we brought them in, and they were great collaborators. I mean, obviously they bring an understanding of the kind of cultural significance of various components, the indigenous cultural significance. So that gave us an understanding that we wouldn't naturally have. And we were able to weave that thinking, into the fabric of the building. Like, the expression of the building is inspired by the fancy dancer shawl, which has these sort of metal jingles attached to it, like within the weaves that make a sound as the dancers dance. So that kind of inspired the idea of the fringe, which and it's an interesting story because when we detailed it, we initially had used stainless steel mesh as the material to represent the fringe, and luckily we in the contract we required multiple mock-ups before final decisions were made on certain things. So when we had the mock-up of the metal mesh, the aluminum, the stainless steel mesh, uh, I arranged to go out and see it with Joe, and we both stood there and looked at it, and I thought it was actually kind of working, and Joe said, that's not a fringe, and I said, well, it's kind of an abstract, sort of expression of the fringe. He said, yeah, I understand that, but it won't flow in the wind. It'll do this. So I knew then we had a problem. We had to find another option to represent the shawl, and that's Matt Hickey from Turo sourced these stainless steel beads, and so he sent some samples over. We had another mock-up put up, and Joe came out and he saw it just flowing in the breeze, and he said, "Yeah, that's it. Let's go with that." I sort of expected that when they installed this, it would come in, pre established sheets like 8 feet long, but they were installed one by one. And I remember speaking to the guy from the contractor who was installing them, proud as hell. I'm putting them up one by one. I can do 1,200 a day, and I'll be here for 2 weeks. And they're beautiful.
That's really interesting. I like that.
Yeah. And then and so this was very much a collaborative effort with Matt from Turo, and then the cladding of the building, the upper floors of the building, because the ground floor is very high and very transparent, punctuated by these corten clad pavilions. But the upper floors are clad in aluminum panels that are perforated with varying sizes of perforations, and that sort of suggests a kind of folding in fabric. It's funny when we had the mock-up for the metal cladding, I was worried about the size of the perforations. I wasn't sure they were going to be big enough to read from a distance. And so when the mock-up went up, I was very happy with the perforations. They read beautifully. Joe didn't like the color. It wasn't quite the right silver. So we went through, I think, 4 or 5 more mock-ups just to get the color exactly where Joe felt comfortable with it. And that's what's up there today.
Oh, that's really cool. Thanks for sharing those examples of the
Mm.
process and how you worked through it. It's really because there's if people are looking this up online, there's amazing pieces, including what Michael's talked about. There's a canoe inside. There's the red road staircase and art everywhere. It's beautiful.
Yeah. Yeah.
So you've mentioned Joe Hester a couple times, so I'd like to just
Mhm.
shift to him with Anishnawbe Health Toronto. If you can tell us, because what I've read and listened to him about, from him is about his expression of the importance of Indigenous history and identity for Indigenous peoples in as part of the healing process. So if you can talk to his involvement and some of the key other things that he was involved in shaping this building, that would be cool.
Well, I mean, he was a visionary. We were lucky to have been able to spend as much time with him as we did. He was very, like I said, he said he wanted this place to be for everyone. So he was very inclusive in his thinking. But he also understood that this was a very unique site in the context of downtown Toronto, a site that was for and about Indigenous health and Indigenous culture and Indigenous peoples, and to have such an inclusive and resilient sort of expression to the city, that kind of transparency and the importance of landscape, both in the Mill Street Plaza at the corner of Mill and Cherry, and the central courtyard. So that was all very important to him. There's a part of the health center is a ceremonial space that is it's an outdoor space, and it's sort of partly in the building underneath the building and partly part of the central garden. And he was very focused on that, the kind of ceremony that would take place in there. The sweat lodges, there's space for heating up the rocks for the sweat lodges. There's space for other ceremony. And even the garden itself has the garden is organized in different components. The grandmother's teaching areas, there's grandfather's teaching areas, there's, collaboration space, small, small spaces, large spaces. So, it's really organized in a way that's all about telling stories and passing knowledge from one generation to another. So and obviously Matt and Turo were very much part of us having the understanding to be able to express that. Well, I mean, just the way the garden was designed, it has a larger circular space that's called the grandmother's teaching area. But and so there's seating areas, spaces for large groups, small groups, enough space for dance and ceremony. And, and this understanding of this really came through Joe and the work with Turo, to be able to sort of embed that kind of organization into the planning of the garden. So there's grandfather teaching areas, which are a series of benches, and this is all integrated with the landscape fully.
Okay, and how about the connection to the land? Because I think that's really important for Indigenous peoples, and you mentioned that a couple of times, whether it's in the building or whether it's in the hub area. If you can
Yeah,
explain some of that, or the land and the waters.
I mean, this was another important piece for Joe. Like I would often, when I would use the word landscape, he would correct me and say it's land, not landscape. And so the like conceptually thinking of the whole block as a landscape does sort of make you rethink the traditional paradigm of how buildings meet sidewalks and we actually had quite a debate with the city because the city of Toronto had urban design guidelines that said you had to build right to the street line. And in their mind, it was about defining street edges and sidewalks and urban streetscapes, which I totally understand. And when we said we don't want to build on the corner of Mill and Cherry Street, we want that to be open and a connective piece from the city to that central garden. We really had to fight for that. And Joe was part of that, creating that rationale, as was Turo. So, and they did ultimately agree, but the idea of thinking about the site as a landscape requires a new way of thinking about how you introduce built form. So the health center is elevated well above grade. It's very transparent. Matt, he always talked about the ground floor of the health center as, the delta of the Don River, and that this area was the former delta of the Don River. And so he would talk about pebbles in the stream, the way the shallow water of a delta would, move around pebbles. And that's where the idea of the corten clad pavilions. So the ground floor is pretty wide open, but these pavilions contain important program like traditional healer on the ground floor, community kitchen, and the other larger southern one contains the community room. So when you enter the building, you kind of move around those things, and then you find the garden, which is um, there's a four-story atrium where the reception area and the red stair that you referred to earlier is anchored in this Indigenous fable about the Red Road, which is about walking a healthy and intelligent path in life. And these are the kinds of things that Matt from Turo was able to embed in the thinking of the project and had physical manifestations like it's red. you know, and it's a brilliant red and a beautiful red, and it outlines every floor plate all the way up that atrium. And another interesting thing, just while I'm thinking about the atrium, is the shawl that I talked about earlier. It wraps around the building, but then stops where the atrium opens to the garden. One of the conflicting ideas in Turo's thinking was the east direction is a very important direction, and typically would be the direction of entrance. Like when you enter a sweat lodge, you always enter from the east. It's the direction of birth, and so very important. But the orientation of the site didn't allow the entrance to be from the east. So we talked about the shawl wrapping around and stopping to allow that visual and all that light from the east to come in to the building to try and so the entrance is actually from the west, where they wouldn't typically, and indigenous culture wouldn't typically want it, but that's where we created this kind of cylindrical stack of traditional healers. So on each floor, there's a circular corten-clad room that houses a traditional healer, and that's legible in the elevation of the building from top to bottom. And at the bottom, it's the entry vestibule, and the whole ceiling of that vestibule is lit. Uh, so the idea is that when you enter, you're passing under the power of the traditional healer, and that kind of made up for the fact that we weren't entering from the east, but we were entering through an important symbolic force.
Yeah, and those are really important things. So that's really neat how you
Yeah.
could build that into the built form, like you said,
Yeah.
of the building. And I'd made a note. You kind of answered this already, but I'd made a note that Anishnawbe Health Toronto was the first place in Canada to have traditional healers on staff full time, so they could offer Western, traditional, or a combination of both, and the importance of that. So, outside of that, housing those in there physically, is there any other way that within the building itself that the design helped for allowing that health model?
I mean, I don't actually know if Anishnawbe Health was the first to have that, but I do know that Joe was always it was very important to him to balance Western medicine with traditional healing techniques. So each floor has space for the traditional healer, and symbolically they're given importance through, like on a typical clinical floor, the rooms are typically rectilinear from a planning perspective, and the traditional healer is a fully curvilinear room. It's a circular room, and it's clad in the corten. And when you come off the elevator on any floor, you see it right away. So the space for Western medicine, by far dominates the floor plate, but the symbolism of the balance between the two, I think, is very equally weighted.
Oh, that's really neat. I'd love to ask you if there's anything you remember most fondly about working on this project and why.
The thing I've always loved, I think that one of your questions was, is there anything I've learned in architecture that I don't believe anymore? And I think I'm paraphrasing, it might not be exactly, but like the thing I've always loved about architecture is the ability to create an intervention in a community. And I've always believed that that intervention has way more influence than just providing the function that it's uh, there to serve. That it has a place and it changes the the urban context or the community context that you're in forever, and that can be positive or negative. And so you want it to be positive, and you want it to reflect appropriately the context it's in, the neighbors it's relating to. You want it to reflect its cultural value and those that use it. And this was an incredibly rich opportunity to, be part of creating a totally unique urban block in a major North American city, like one that is dedicated to Indigenous culture, Indigenous value, Indigenous people, and be able to have influence way beyond its borders. Like to me, that was an incredibly exciting opportunity to have, and to be able to, collaborate with, the developers and their architects that worked on the other components. I mean, 2.5 acres isn't a big site, and you're putting with, there's uh, large condominiums and rental residential. There's woodworking carpentry shops in the training area. There's a City of Toronto daycare, and there is below grade parking, but not under the health center. The health center, and this goes to your earlier question, the health center sits uh, right on fully on ground. There's no excavation below it, and that was very important to Joe. That the health center be firmly attached to the ground and open to the sky. And the ceremonial space, which is within the garden, is also very open to the sky. So those were all very important things for Joe. And just at a constructability level, the health center was built by Harbridge and Cross, which is they were a, a contractor, and then everything else was built by another contractor. But they were cheek by jowl. So there was a design collaboration among ourselves and Turo and PDP Quadrangle, but there was also incredible collaboration between two major contractors in the city. Making sure that this uh, fine line between two separate sites was very sensitively handled, and it worked out very well. So there's excavation all the way around the health center, but not under the health center.
It's beautiful, rooted in the earth. Yeah.
Rooted in
And, and through to the sky. I love that. And like you said, it's a jewel, I think, for the city and for the Canada in the moment that Canada's
Mhm.
going through in the past decade. So it's really cool to see it
Yeah, yeah,
through completion.
yeah, yeah.
What if we can leave something too? What would you learn if you learned something from this to use in your daily design practice, or something that you remember fondly most about this project? If you could share that and why.
At a fundamental level, like we like I said, we've been working on this since 2014. The list of people that have worked on this project, people like Suzanne Crysdale and so many others. It's been a real joy to collaborate with so many people that have all focused on a very, I guess, focused goal of achieving something great for this project in the city. Then and the opportunity to work again with Turo um, was very important. Like working, you don't often get to work with a client as visionary as someone like Joe Hester. It's such a shame he didn't get to live to see the full realization of the project. But Michael Millward is his successor, and he worked under Joe for years, and he sort of picked up that baton, I think, beautifully. And I was speaking to him just the other day, and he was saying to me that, when people walk in the entrance of this building, he said, what they say to me is they feel like they've come home. And I thought that was pretty profound.
That is that's almost the perfect way to sum up, and that's what you want, right? Something that feeling of home.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Well, that's beautiful. Thank you so much, Michael, for coming on today and sharing your thoughts about this project and your experience working with our partners. And we thank everyone for listening to the Stantec Design Hive.
You've been listening to the Stantec Design Hive, the Stantec Buildings podcast. We hope you'll be back for our next episode featuring discipline leader for design computing, Brendan Mullins. Brendan will tell us about designing complex parabolic structures, harnessing data, and using AI tools in the design practice. See you then.